Okay, Pillsy, this I don't want to spend too much time on, and I get that it's a bit of a trivial statistic, but after Brady Tkachuk had his first fight of the year on Tuesday and the Senators lost, well, they allowed the goal when he was in the box there for the instigator.
That was the TSN turning point of the game, in my opinion.
And it's in the first period. So I was like, what's the Sens record when Brady Tkachuk gets into a fight? And if you follow us on Twitter at Sens Central, you saw me post this last night. The record is not good. When he fights, the Senators are 8-24-2 in 34 games. Now, funny enough, the best season the Sens had when he fought the most, he had 7 fights rather, so not the most, he had 8 in another year. When he had 7 fights in the COVID season with no fans, the Sens were 5-2, which is so ironic because the whole point, I get it's firing up your bench, but it's firing up the crowd as well and all that. If you take out like when fans are in the building, the Senators have 3 wins in 27 games when Brady Tkachuk fights. They're 3-22-2. It's such a peculiar stat, and I had people right away jump in the comments, and I get this thought process that he fights when the games are out of reach at the end. Frankly, I found more 2-minute roughing and 10-minute misconducts at the end of games that I don't count in this. A lot of these fights, and I went back to the start of the 2021-22 season after that All-Canadian division, and I went back, and you can find it all on Twitter. I'm not going to bore you with all the numbers, but a lot of the fights are in the first and second periods in games that are 1 goal, one way or another. It's not the case that he just fights at the end of games. He's more important on the ice. And I love a good Brady Tkachuk fight, don't get me wrong. But he doesn't need to be fighting on, like, if Timmy got hurt on a clean hit, go for it. And I get it's a split-second decision, but he was fine. So it feels like,
and it was a clean hit.
It was a super clean hit, and Timmy popped right back up. Take a number. Get him later in the game. I just didn't think that they needed that in that moment. Maybe he felt like Buffalo was all over them, which they were early in that game, and felt like it would also help change the momentum. Brady admitted it was weird fighting a friend, an old line mate. Jordan Greenway played together at Boston University. I just think you need Brady on the ice. And then Ottawa got a power play soon after, and they don't have their best power play net front guy. It just really kind of was a snowball effect. And I get that this was an exaggerated example of it, but let's just see Brady do his thing out there. If the time calls for a fight, let's do it. But let's see him work on getting the pucks in goal tonight, because he's been doing that great. He's got at least a point in 11 out of 12 games. So I don't want this to be misconstrued as Brady Tkachuk slander, all that. It just is interesting to note that the last time the Senators won a game that he got in a fight was the one against Jacob Trouba at Madison Square Garden. That's 12 straight games where he's fought and the Sens lose.
And the irony of that, Ross, is that is the exact perfect time when you want Brady Tkachuk to fight and the right opponent. Like, if you told me Brady Tkachuk's going to fight Jacob Trouba, center ice, Madison Square Garden, hell yeah, go for it, Brady. If you told me Brady Tkachuk's going to fight Greenway in the first period in Buffalo, maybe hold off on that one. And the results are there. And I think, Ross, you can even take fighting out of the equation here. Let's just say, for how many total games has Brady Tkachuk fought in?
34.
So let's just say for 34 games, you pick Brady up and put him in timeout for 5 minutes. No fight. Like, don't even talk about the fight momentum swing, whether he needs to do it, the player he's fighting up against. Take all that out of the equation. Taking one of your best players and your captain out of the game for 5 minutes alone is the biggest detriment to why the Sens probably aren't able to succeed when Brady Tkachuk gets in a fight, because, especially like you mentioned, Ross, they get a power play and Brady's in the box. Doesn't do you a whole lot of good. So it's unfortunate that that's the case, because I think it goes without saying, both of us love watching a good tilt, especially when someone like Brady, who can really chuck them and chucks them with passion. We love seeing that. But it's getting to a point now where this isn't an Ottawa Senators rebuilding team where you're just trying to get people's respect and you're pissed off when people disrespect you. They're going for more now. As Brady Tkachuk said, we want more. Well, then you have to learn to have the discipline, I'll say, to not get in those kinds of fights, and especially not get in those kinds of fights with much lesser players. Like, that's a great trade-off for the Buffalo Sabres. They do that 10 times out of 10, not doing it early in the game. And the last thing we want is for Brady Tkachuk to get a hand injury or some kind of injury off a fight as well. So it's unfortunate that it's that skewed, that the Sens lose that often when he gets in a fight, but I think maybe that's an important lesson to learn, and that's something the Senators are going to have to, the leadership group, Brady Tkachuk especially, is going to have to learn and mature from and get a little bit more disciplined moving forward.
That's a Locked On Sens exclusive stat as I manually track that through game logs year over year over year. And then I asked our good friend, Mr. T. Raynard, I said, what about Chris Neil? What's the record when Chris Neil fought in games? And he fought in 166 games. The Senators were 87, 64, and 13 plus 2 ties. I don't know if some of our younger audience remember those back in the day. But Pillsy, the craziest stat about that is Mr. T tells us that in 10 games, he fought twice.
Wow, man, that's classic.
10 games with 2 fights, and then he even doubled down. The Sens were 6-4-0 when Chris Neil fought twice in a single game. What an animal.
And those fought twice games are probably against the same players. Like, Chris Neil probably didn't get the best of him in the first one. He's like, no, we're going again. I want a better match here. But, Ross, this is a perfect argument. Chris Neil, 5 minutes in the box, doesn't affect your overall game plan that much. And you're probably on the right side of the exchange where Chris Neil goes and fights one of the top defensemen or a top 6 forward. You're loving that trade-off every single time. So that, I think, is a perfect example of the trade-off of, I don't want to, well, no, I was going to say I don't want to call Chris Neil a goon, but he was a bit of a goon.
Tough guy. Enforcer.
Tough guy. Enforcer. That's a better narrative to say. Superstar, yeah. But that's where it makes sense for those guys to have that role. And I think it's being made clear here. So great job with that one, Ross. That's a good little rabbit hole to go down.
And if anybody wants to help us out here with this stat, because people are like, how can you compare this to someone else? And I'm trying to think, like, he's such a unique player. If somebody could go back and check Gabriel Landeskog with Colorado in his early 20s when it was a bad team, I'm curious to know how many fights he got in and what the Avalanche record is. So please put that in the YouTube comments.